In this episode, I speak to Aaron Young about the ethical dilemmas of a maverick. Aaron shares his journey in Africa, where his ethics were challenged greatly, and the long-term consequences that he still lives with today. During the conversation, we talk about the pragmatism of Mavericks and how they deal with adversity. We discuss the Socialised Maverick's call towards being justice-driven and what happened to Aaron's principles when he was faced with being sent to an African prison. Listen up to the rest of the conversation. Before we begin our conversation, here is a quick shout out to the pathologically curious. Check out the Maverick Paradox magazine. It's a digital magazine written by Mavericks for business owners and professionals. You can find the magazine at themaverickparadox.com. The magazine's aim is to provoke maverick leadership everywhere. Welcome to the Maverick Paradox podcast, where we explore what it is to be a maverick and discover effective modes of leadership. I am Judith Germain, and my mission is to propel the maverick mindset into a world where character and integrity will ultimately have a higher premium than personality and bureaucracy. So thank you for joining me on this journey. If you would like to continue with me, then please subscribe to my podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or one of the other popular podcast platforms. And today our guest is Aaron Young. Hi, Aaron.
Hi, Judith. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. You?
Awesome. Really excited to be here having a chat with you.
You know what? I can always tell when I've got Australians on because everything's awesome.
You can't complain when you've got weather like ours. You know, if we're whinging and moaning, there's something wrong with us.
You know what? I think there is something to do with climate because those that are in areas that are sunny most of the time are generally appear to be more happy.
I think that it's either the weather or it's they drink more. So you've got to be cautious about which one that might be. I'm the previous of the two, not the latter. But you never know with Aussies, especially.
Okay, that sounds cool. So, Aaron, who are you?
Well, that's a lovely question. Look, my story is long and sordid and has everything in it. But we're going to go into, I guess, the word maverick.
Yeah, I define that.
Why? Yeah, you define it for me, and then let's see how I fit into that definition.
Okay, so my definition of maverick is someone who is willfully independent.
Wow. Well, I mean, that's a really complimentary way of putting me because I've been called a lot worse, as I mentioned earlier. So I think what we'll do is we'll hone in on something that's still affecting me now. It's an experience that started for me in 2004. When I left Australia and moved to the Middle East. I spent a few years in the Middle East, didn't really enjoy it, but towards the end of it, before the bubble burst in Dubai, I fell in love with a woman who was from a place called Zimbabwe, which is north of South Africa, south of Zambia, nestled in between Botswana and Mozambique. And with the bubble bursting, her passport was immediately, or a visa was immediately cancelled, and she had to leave Dubai. So in my temporary insanity that I've suffered from during my 47 years on this planet, I decided to pack everything up and follow her back to Africa. I'd never been. And I do a lot of that. That's whether you say willfully independent. There's certainly something, definitely am also occasionally willfully stupid as well, but my stupidity's taken me some beautiful places. So I ended up initially in South Africa where very quickly, very, very quickly, I was in a place called Nelspruit, right next to the Kruger Park. I fell in love with African wildlife. I was blessed. I spent every weekend driving around that park, chasing lions, elephant, white rhino, black rhino, you name it, learning every single antelope species there was, the behaviour of the dwarf mongoose. I just fell in love. It was the most awe-inspiring and most earthbound journey for me because I'd always had my head in the stars, and this experience brought me crashing down to earth in the most humbling and beautiful way. So we got married in South Africa, and then that little place called Zimbabwe, just north of South Africa, was seeing I guess, a rebirth after what had happened in early 2000 with their chief and commander, Robert Mugabe at the time. And my wife now said, well, she wanted to go home, back to Zimbabwe. So we packed up an old truck and we drove up through Botswana, and we entered Zimbabwe in around 2008. And from there, the story gets a little bit crazy. So the short of it is the relationship ended, sadly, relatively quickly for want of a substance abuse problem, which went and took me down all sorts of incredible twists and turns, from running from authorities, living in a tent in Mozambique on the border at one point, to being forcibly attempted deporting and then bribing my way out of that situation a number of times. And so what happened and what I needed to do was find a way to legally stay in Zimbabwe, which is not possible now because the amount of money being paid to have me kept out of it was larger than I had to keep me in it. And that's the way Africa works, bribes and counter bribes. My counter bribes just weren't strong enough. So I jumped over into Mozambique on the eastern border with Zimbabwe for a little while, and accidentally I went to do a conservation program with farming, which was teaching locals how to farm and do different methods instead of slash and burn farming, to use conservation farming methods. In the process, I started helping to relocate local villages out of a place called Gorongosa National Park, which is right on the eastern seaboard of the Mozambique as a country. And eventually the boss I was working for, as this happens a lot in Africa, he was a little too flamboyant, a little too drunk a lot of the time, had a falling out with the donor of the project, and I was instantaneously out of work and stranded in Mozambique. So I found my way to his son's safari camp, and I was asked to help out and help manage the place. When I got there, I found it very quickly. It was a hunting camp, and their specialty was hunting leopards and hunting elephants and hunting all sorts of other African species. I was surrounded at that point by a lot of gung-ho macho men, and I thought this hunting gig in the early days had its merit. I believed the old thinking that it was a necessary evil that was required to keep populations in control, and that they were doing the wildlife a favour by being present because they were the ones anti-poaching and they were the ones protecting the land that otherwise would have been overrun and just destroyed. After about 3 or 4 months of watching underage lions shot, elephants tracked to the point of what I would say extinction within that local area, my stomach turned, and I very quickly realised that the attitude with hunting that may have existed, say, 60 years ago was long, long gone, and it would become a case of shoot everything and kill it before someone else does. Sustain what you can if you can, but if you see a threat to it, shoot it because there's a dollar value to it. So after about 4 months of that, I moved back to Zimbabwe. At this time, the pressure of the local authorities had backed off me and I was no longer under threat. I could lay low, so to speak, and pay enough bribes to stay. So I did this and eventually fell into an incredible job with a gentleman who used to be a National Parks and Wildlife Officer with the Zimbabwe Parks and Wildlife Authority for about 40 years. He was also a trained combat tracker from the Rhodesian Bush War, and he taught me tracking, he taught me wildlife, he taught me game capture, how to capture and relocate any type of species, and how to transport them across countries, across restocking national parks, private sales, etc. So I fell into that incredible job and that incredible experience, remembering that I didn't have a clue what I was doing. As with pretty much any of my experiences, I said yes and learnt as I went. So I cut my teeth very early on restocking and moving elephants into a place called Umfurudzi National Park, moving antelope species into the western border of Mozambique, restocking a small park in Malawi, and again, just getting more and more hands-on experience with these species. And, for these guys who'd been their entire lives, I was playing catch-up and I did a pretty good job of it. Within about 3 years, I started to find that the way things were being done it was corrupt, which is to be accepted in Africa because corruption is fairly much the norm. But I think it got to a point where the corruption was so agreeable to everyone that they were forgetting the bigger picture. So I decided to go to war. That's quite harsh. I decided to take people to task a little bit more vocally about the future of their actions on African wildlife.
And well, you're not frightened about that, though. Wasn't that not a scary thing to do?
No. See, we can't go back into my early childhood, my life. My life was very much a series of T-junctions with a huge amount of fear presented, where I just learnt that whenever there's fear, you step into it.
Right, okay.
And it is a little crazy look to say that, and in my current work, I would say that to people, you do it. Whenever you're scared, you step into it, because we don't live in an unsafe world anymore. Now, in saying that, where I was, it was a little crazy. It was. Some of the things that we could talk about, me chasing lions, being charged by bull elephants, and I stopped carrying a weapon and just carried a camera. And so I was having these experiences without a weapon present. So it was a little crazy. But I always had this, I guess, I want to say beautiful sense of adventure, but also an underlying need to be a maverick, to coin a phrase, to stand above the rest and to leave a legacy. I believe my early childhood and my experiences that led me to these later experiences in life were not a waste. They were given to me to test me, harden me, whatever you want to call it, hone me into someone who could do things that others couldn't. Now, crazy as it may seem, and sometimes crazy as it was, I wouldn't have been able to do any of this if I didn't have that attitude.
Okay.
And it was. There are moments there I look back now and I realise, especially 5 years after some of these events, and where we'll lead into in a second, where it was just foolhardy. But again, would I take it back? No. All but one element of my life I wouldn't regret and I wouldn't change for anything. So where were we? Yeah, so I woke up one day and people would come to me with conservation stories because no one really wanted to help unless there was funding money. And they would say, can you help? Can you help? And so what I would try and do was connect sponsors and connect projects together to try and get people to save a couple of zebra that have been abandoned, or an impala that was injured, or whatever species. And I just did little bits of this more and more. So this morning I woke up, I heard of a plight of an elephant that was in a town called Chirundu, which is on the northern border of Zimbabwe and Zambia. And his name we nicknamed him Hopalong. Hopalong was a bit of a problem. He was probably close to 50, and he lived in this area of Chirundu his entire life. Hopalong, he had a pronounced limp, so that's where we came up with that rather inventive name. And what Hopalong was doing was getting increasingly aggressive towards the locals. As it was a border town, he was stamping his authority, and he was actually stealing food out of trucks and just becoming more and more of a problem. About a week prior to hearing the story about Hopalong, an elephant had been shot by National Parks and Wildlife under the guise of what is called a PAC ruling, which is a problem animal control ruling. And that was the animal was deemed a danger to humans, so they killed it. Now, the truth was it wasn't a danger to anyone. The humans were a danger to it, and it was a political move to buy votes in the area by giving fresh elephant meat to the locals.
Okay.
Hopalong
let me just stop you there. So your time in Africa was all about trying to do conservation in the right and proper way, and you came across quite a lot of political grandstanding and corruption. But assuming you're not in Africa now, what did you learn from that's applicable elsewhere, and what eventually made you decide, it's time to leave and do something else?
Okay, I guess we'll start with the why did I leave part, because the long story short of it is, after years of conservation, I had to leave because of the political grandstanding, because basically I was getting things done that others couldn't, and I was doing it cleanly with money that was clearly raised and shown to the world where the money had come from, what was being spent. People who operate in Africa in the NGO or the not-for-profit world, they don't want to see that transparency. That money is paying their wages and keeping them in Africa in their dream lifestyle. Whereas I always thought bigger and always thought that there was actually a mission that was being, we were trying to achieve. So I didn't look to my pocket. And that's just a rarity in Africa. You just don't see enough of it. And on the political side, I was also winning too many battles in public. And they didn't like that because I was a foreigner. And because as a white guy, it just doesn't look good for Zimbabwean politics, especially with the previous issues they have with the farmers, etc. So even though I've increasingly pushed national parks, African national park staff in front of me to take the glory and to do everything, I was always I was the person that would be called first, and they didn't like it. It was a huge insult to them. So I left conservation, partly because I felt it was a hopeless battle and I was frustrated with what I was seeing as the status quo or the dogma that everyone just lived by. Secondly, is I had young children now, and it doesn't pay. You do conservation because you love it, not because, for me, because I loved it, not because there was any money in it.
Yeah.
So I decided to leave it. I went farming, and sadly, I carried my crusader mentality of anti-corruption, anti-theft, building a model society, a model business, building a model Zimbabwe, because I believed the country had the potential to be the jewel of Africa again, into my farming. And once again, I got embroiled in what was essentially a war between two owners and an external politician. That's a story in itself. Sadly, I lost the war. I won in that I created the model farm, a profitable farm, no corruption, no theft. It was incredible. I had people flying in from South Africa to check the things we were doing. I'd never seen a farm in my life. I stepped on that farm, and within 6 months, I'd created that beautiful,
How did
thing.
you do that, Aaron?
I guess I just it sounds really cliche. The first thing that came to my mind when you said that, I followed my heart. And I know that sounds a little crazy. I didn't know a chicken farm to save my life. I'd never seen one in my entire life. I'd never seen a farm really, except, riding on the side of a tractor as maybe a 7-year-old kid. I just said yes. It was an opportunity. The farm was right next door to a game park. So the house I was going to live in and raise my kids in, we were waking up to giraffe every morning. So to me, I was presented with an opportunity. I don't say no to opportunity. So how did I do it? I stuck to my guns, and I did. I followed my gut. I looked at the people and I realized what my greatest assets were, and they were the people. In life, we don't achieve many great things alone. It tends to be a combination of the people around us, and that can be sometimes just our families, or it can be in a business. It can be our teammates or the people we work with. On a farm, it was 100 staff, poverty-stricken, people not being paid, people being paid in rations only, and I changed that. I paid them in hard US currency. I looked after them. I weeded out the thieves. I got rid of them. And when the unions and the politicians came in and said rehire them, I went to war with them and said, I will not do that. And for that, I got a lot of abuse, a lot of guns pointed at me, a lot of threats. And, eventually there was a greater war between the two directors of the farm, which just turned incredible to the point where the death threats got so bad, the military showing up, etc., threatening to kill me. I had to leave. And that takes, I guess, to the next part, leaving that.
Before you get to that, let's just... Yeah. It's interesting because Mavericks are very... Socialised Mavericks are very justice-orientated. So I can see how you said you took that crusader mentality everywhere you go. It's like, this is the right thing to do. This is how my principles falls. I will follow my principles. So I totally understand you doing that. And I think it's it kind of makes me giggle in the sense that you're very blasé about, the military came, they're preparing guns, I had to leave. And I think that's I giggle a bit because it's kind of very mavericky, because it's kind of this, it's a pragmatic approach. I needed to do something. I did it. What's the big fuss? I can totally imagine myself, telling the same story and be like, so I just had to leave. So I got on a plane, took the children. I could just imagine, because I think I think that's why Mavericks are good at jumping over obstacles, because they don't get
you have that initial response, which is not to say that you don't get frightened or you don't cry or don't get emotional. You do all that, and then you go, okay, so this is where it is. So honestly, you just don't, you have a natural, normal human emotion and feel to things, and you could be frightened or whatever, but then you go, stuff needs to be done. So you get very pragmatic about it and just go with it.
No, I think you're very right. You've actually, as you're saying, there's something's really hitting me. It's like I said, you asked me a question, so I followed my heart. I think sometimes more I followed my soul, and I think probably something that Mavericks would share in common is that we do that. There's that part. We don't understand it. We can't put our finger on it. And when you ask me, again, because it is funny, and the reason I like telling my story is I'm blasé about things. And it's only when you just said that I've stopped and gone, I just brush over it. One time I had a platoon pull out at the farm, and an officer, I think he was an officer, walked up to me, put an AK to my head. I literally put my hand on the banana clip of that AK. I pulled the clip out and field stripped the weapon in front of him.
That's so funny.
But I was scared to death. That was actually the moment I thought I was going to die. But my reaction to that was to be arrogant and cocky, because I had to keep a semblance of strength in that farm as well, because that farm wasn't me. That farm, and this is me, again, I'm going to say that I believed it was the new Zimbabwe. I genuinely believed and got caught up in this idea that if I could prove this farm could operate without corruption and without theft and with staff who didn't see colour, all the old Robert Mugabe days gone, that there was hope, I believed, in that country of recreating the jewel of Africa that it was 30 years before. And now I look back on it after what happened to me. And that farm, 10 months after I left that farm, ended up causing me to go to prison. I went into Zimbabwe in prison the first time in December of 2018 because I was set up. Because of the politicians and because of the people I'd upset, eventually, they don't forget, They're very African politicians, or Zimbabwean politicians, are very much like an elephant. They never forget. And the guys who were at the bottom that I stepped on and made an example of eventually clawed their way to the top, and they came gunning for me. And so I was scooped up one morning and dragged into the prison system. They tried to break me for about 48 hours, beat me senseless to get me to just jump on a plane and leave, which I refused because I wasn't going to leave my family. And then after 2 days, they charged me formally with about 7 or 8 charges, fraud, counterfeiting, a whole bunch of trumped-up junk. And then they put me into the prison system. And so eventually I was found. Everyone outside realised where I was. They got hold of me. And then I proceeded to bribe all and sundry that I could to try and get out of prison and fight my case from outside. Now, the charges of fraud alone, I should have been instantly deported or given 10 years. I managed to bribe my way out just before Christmas of December 2018. And I went to court for 8 months every single week, which was probably the scariest experience of my life. Every single week walking into that courtroom and bribing every single time. Bribes every time. Bribing the judges, bribing the public prosecutors, bribing immigration officials, bribing constantly, not knowing where your money's going. But I wasn't leaving.
Because I'm interested in your take on this, because I think some people listening will look at this from the viewpoint of the country that they're residing in and thinking that's, so the idea of bribing judges to do what's right will not sit or will sit heavy on some people. Do you want to? So this is your opportunity to explain that if you want to.
Yeah, no, I can explain that. The truth was, look, it's just the way the system worked. I wasn't going to sit and do 10 years in prison, and I wasn't going to get on a plane and leave. I wasn't going to leave my kids. My kids at this point were sort of 5 and 3. They didn't know I was in prison. And so you get yourself a lawyer in Zimbabwe when I was finally allowed to find one. And he came to me and basically presented the case as, you're going to have to either get on that plane or bribe this person, this person, this person, this person. Now, for me, my ultimate mission in this life, no matter what happens, is to be a father. So regardless of me now entering into the very system that I've been fighting against, which is to be corrupt, because this is what I became. Very quickly, I didn't care anymore about being anti-corruption because I was not leaving my children and there was no way that my children were going to be able to follow me. So I guess it was a case of, one, the charges were trumped up. It was a political setup. So I now didn't really, I guess I didn't measure myself by the same set of laws and principles. I was in a fight for my life.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I look back on it, and it's a paradox in itself. There's a ton of irony in someone telling my story as I did, and then talking very blasé about bribing all and sundry without a blink of an eye.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in that intersection, really, because it's that kind of pragmatism. But I would suspect, and you tell me if I'm wrong, that you didn't go against your principles.
No, I didn't.
In that process, because your justice, doing the right thing, was probably pulling on you higher than having to enter into a system that you saw probably as a temporary thing. And then, it's not like you're going to live your life like that for the rest of your life.
No,
and you wouldn't try to do that
no.
in Australia, would you? You wouldn't go,
no, definitely.
To the court and go, can I give you some money so I don't have to pay this parking fine or something?
No, and if we get to a point, I mean, there's post stories after this where you'll see where I actually rebelled in the opposite, where let me go. I'll see as this unfolds. Actually, I ended up back in neighbouring Mozambique right at the end of my story. And it's interesting, as I was trying to cross into Malawi to do a visa run to get a new visa, I was presented with an opportunity where a border guard asked for a bribe. And I bring it up because this is when I realised that I had to leave Africa for good. I almost took a swing at him. And it wasn't even a conscious, I'm not a violent person. I'm always incredibly well-grounded when operating in these parts of the world. It's why I was always so successful in them. What had happened was that my action of paying these bribes and entering into that system basically eroded part of who I was and what I stood for. The irony of what I was doing was not lost on me, but I put my children as a higher value. And that was that I had to stay there no matter what it took. Right or wrongly, I'm still not sure how that sits with me. And it's interesting that you've brought the intersection up, because even just talking to you now, I can feel these little stumbles within me about assessing it. How did I feel? It made me sick. I went to court until August of 2019 for my day of sentencing. And I bribed all the way through up to this point. And I bribed everyone to get a lenient sentence, which was a bunch of fines, and the time I'd served being enough for me to walk free. Now, what ended up happening on the day of sentencing was my lawyer had set me up. So all these so-called bribes I'd been paying him to pay to these people most of them had gone into his pocket. So instead of going home to my kids, I went down into the cells under Harare Courthouse, and then very quickly was ushered into Chikurubi main prison in Harare, and to serve out my initial 3 months. I think then it was a 7 month, and then 10 years. Yeah. And so this is what happened. And this is why I say for all my love of trying to put my kids as high value and not taking what was probably an olive branch of getting on a plane in the early days cost me untold amounts of money, because that money just vanished. And I'm now back where I started, which is in a prison. Now, in saying that, I should touch on the fact that a Zimbabwean prison, just quickly, I'm not some hardened monster, who scares everyone off. Harare prisons, by African prison standards, are just as filthy and horrible as you can imagine to look at, but the people inside them were very different to anything you would expect, say, in South Africa or the Congo, or if you went to places in East Africa. It was a very easy place for me to survive. So it wasn't as extreme as some people hear African prison and think I'm a superhuman, that I survived 2 stints in there. It was a challenge, but it certainly wasn't like I was under death threat constantly while I was in there.
Were there a lot of people in the prison because they couldn't afford the bribes?
Oh, yeah, tons. I mean,
people who were in the prison because they deserved to be in prison.
We could go, if we go into that alone. The first time I went in there for 2 or 3 days, I was watched by a couple of the bigger guys in there. And I'll mention 2 guys in particular. One was Aeli, who was an Ethiopian, and a guy called John, who was from South Sudan. They're both political prisoners. They'd been in there at that point. Aeli had been in for 6 years without charge, and John had been in for about 4.5, just under 5 years without charge. Both of their countries had them locked up in Zimbabwe so they couldn't cause political problems in their home home states. So they could afford to get food smuggled in, for example, because that was allowed, because as political prisoners, they were allowed some sense of comfort. But as for any right to a solicitor or to any access to media or anyone to tell their story, no, that was all for that entire prison system. That was not allowed. And most of the poor guys who came in there were unable to buy food, let alone any legal support. I mean, if you were caught stealing a piece of copper cable, which was sold on the black market, mainly to Chinese buyers in Zimbabwe, it was an instant 10-year sentence. You didn't get a right to defend yourself, and that could be 1 foot of copper cable. It was 10 years. So I spent a lot of time jailhouse lawyering and helping a lot of guys try and write up legal documents and trying to get amnesty in there, and trying to also teach them about the evils of alcohol, because alcohol is a big problem.
Okay, so you're obviously not in prison, so you came out.
Yeah, I did.
How does it change you? Did it change you in any way?
Oh, yeah, it did. I always considered myself incredibly humble. I think after that experience, especially the second time when I walked back into that prison, I was hailed as like a returning king, which is a really weird thing to say, but one of the defining moments of my life, because I looked after the men so well the first time I'd been in there. Me coming back in, I was, I don't know, respected on a level that you don't see much in society, and I found it in an African prison. How else is it? Yeah, I'm humbled constantly and daily, because the two men, Aeli and John, are still locked up there. I haven't been able to get amnesty to take their case on. I'm also sometimes I'm going to be honest, I don't talk about this much, but I am sometimes traumatized by it. And being back in the first world, it's actually of some sort of sick benefit to me. I watched people almost die in front of my eyes in that prison, you know, with people, gang violence and also just race violence, you know, one African tribe against another. And it helps me teach people in the first world about gratitude and how powerful and how potent gratitude is. But because I can use my experiences that I lived through, for example, prison, as examples, it seems to have this incredible effect on bringing people down to earth and having a look around at them, at the small things, at the little beauties that I think they overlook. So for me, it gave me a deep sense of gratitude. But what's more important is my ability to teach and share that with others.
Okay, so let's go there then. So let's leave Africa for now and look at what are you doing now? Are you now teaching other people gratitude, like you said, or?
Yeah, so I'm a qualified life coach and business coach now. So when I came back to Australia, January last year, I thought I'd just get a job. I thought with my CV, there's plenty of experience there, and I must have sent it out 150 times. No one even replied to say thanks for your CV. I'd speak to people and they'd be amazed by my journey, but no one wanted to give you a job because I had 10 years of elephant tracking and, you know, safari and shooting film, and no one wanted a bar of it. In the first world, you don't fit into the pigeonhole. So after about 7 months of that, I was like, this is ridiculous. I can't do this. I'm going to have to make something happen. So I stumbled across a guy who was training life coaches. So I sat through it all and very quickly realized that what he was teaching me, I'd been teaching people for years, you know, basic leadership principles, empathy within us as a species, and then also things like gratitude, courage, trust, all these basic, very basic spiritual principles, and how to get people to actually use them. Because what I've found in my travels and in my humble experience is the world is addicted to the idea of personal development and growth. We buy the books, we watch the documentaries, we're in awe of these gurus and these people out there, but we don't do anything with it. So my approach to this is to inspire people to take action, not just read. So I don't send my clients off to read a bunch of books and watch a documentary. I hold them to strict, I'd say, yeah, it's harder than your average life coach because I confront people. You know, my aim is to help people be the best version of themselves. I believe that there's not a human being I've ever met that is not innately 10 times more powerful than what they give themselves credit for. And that's an understatement. Most people, it's 100 times or 1,000 times. I believe that my business is catalyst. I'm the catalyst to help them see it. But with great success, or let's say great achievement, comes great effort. You know, no one great in this world woke up and was just handed to him on a platter. And so that's why the name coach. You know, I'm the guy who stands on the sideline screaming harder, more, not hard enough, go again. You know, I set guidelines for people, set routines for them, how to start their day, you know, the little things, and constantly bring back to the joy of life, because I've seen it and I've experienced in hell and in heaven across many continents and many countries. And so that my gift of my experience in my life is to try and compact what I've lived in and give that to someone so they can feel inspired to take action.
I like that. Do you do public speaking?
Yeah, I've started. This is the whole point with the podcast now, is I actually would like to start doing more of it. I've started to do some, and I'm being called to do little bits and pieces. But I believe that I'm scraping the surface of my story with these podcasts. And that's why I want to do more and more and go into these stories more, because I believe that there's an amount of untapped power within what I've lived, that if I can find the right people, interviewers, the right questions, I can help a lot of people, because we've come to, I believe, a place in our sort of dim-witted history as a species where we're addicted to knowledge, but we're scared of wisdom. And for me, the definition or the defining moment between knowledge and wisdom is knowledge is the documentaries, the books, the gurus, the tapes, the programs. Wisdom is when you put it into action. I want to be that inspiration moment between the knowledge turning into wisdom. I want people to actually be the best version and can throw the book away. You know what I mean? I want to see people succeed, you know, be better parents, better partners, better business people, better people. Because, you know, right now I think the world needs one thing more than anything is just a good example of community leaders, people around us who just stand up for what is right without aggression, without picking an aggressive side, without pointing fingers and saying you're wrong and I'm right. Just stable, peaceful community leaders that we can stand beside, because politicians aren't doing us any good, you know, and the bulk of what we've got out there isn't great. So I feel that if we can start developing community leadership again, we can start to sort of claw back some of this, what I call, you know, maybe devolution. We start evolving again instead of going a little bit backwards.
Right, I love that. I mean, what you've demonstrated there is exactly what effective Maverick leaders do. They work for the greater good, and they do inspire people to take action, to do stuff. And the idea of community leaders, you know, that where everybody's a leader, whether they're a child, an old man, or you know, it doesn't matter. Everybody's a leader, so everybody needs to lead. And this is, you know, as part of what I'm doing, you know, is to enable leadership, you know, effective leadership for everybody.
Yeah. And we need it, because it's sorely lacking. What's happened is we've developed this perspective of what a leader is, and that is, you know, a politician, a celebrity, a sports person. And without taking away from these people, none of them are leaders, not one. They're theatrical people. They're on a stage performing, and we sort of seem to be all bowing down to that. And I think that's because we disassociate from something who we only watch and know through a screen. Whereas when we have people at community grassroots level, these now become real people that we know. We see them live the example. That's how I believe leadership works, by the scene, not watching television and not being told through a press release or a documentary that's been carefully orchestrated to present something. Real life leaders solving real life problems. It gives people the confidence to step up, like you said, and be a leader.
I think good leaders don't see themselves as leaders, because what they're doing is what's natural. Do you know what I mean? You can enable other people to be that way. You know, you don't get born, you don't come out of your mother's womb with I'm a leader. You know? And even if your environment was rubbish, you know, it doesn't mean you can't become a leader.
Not at all. In fact, the opposite to a certain degree.
So yeah, I definitely get that, and I think that's where I would say the Crusader mentality comes from, that kind of everybody's a role model, everybody should work for the greater good, everyone should stand up for what they believe in. And what you've demonstrated for your story is that there are times where you have to probably carve out your own moral stance, because sometimes you have to do things. It's like you've gone through a complete ethical dilemma, but at the end of what you've done, you've chosen to step back into the life that you were leading in terms of an ethical standpoint.
And I think if you don't, I think you start to suffer. You watch what happens to people who don't. That's when in my experience, I've seen this is where you see more alcohol creep in, and you see other biases creep in, because when we're not living to that true core soul value, which all of us has a very similar set, not the same identical, but very similar, that there is a moral fiber within us, then we start needing things to mask the pain or the thoughts. And that is the part of us that's screaming, don't do it. Don't be like that. Don't steal. Don't lie. Don't philander. Don't cheat. Don't, because it's become such a normal thing these days. And again, I believe you'll get that when you see a guy who lives 2 doors down from you, or you see, your local scout leader, or real men or real people, real women performing real acts of courage in front of you. Not these bigger figures on TV, not these almost ghosts, because they're not real. Most of us will watch, a person on television our entire lives, never see them. We don't know the reality of who they are and what they really stand for, whereas from a community level, we can. And that inspiration is contagious, and we need more of that, more contagions that inspire.
You know what I think? I agree. I think what's telling was when I asked you, how did you feel against doing something that you would categorize as unprincipled? And what I heard was the slight tremble in the voice, the silence while you were reflecting. And what I got was that it bothers you deeply and you've not come to terms with it yet. But you can live with it, but you're not to terms with it. And I think the fact that you're in that space shows the leader in you. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. And also, look, it's costing my kids. My kids are still trapped back there, So the reality in the tail end of this story was I was put on a plane at gunpoint, and I left the country, not by choice. It was basically people outside paid bribes to have me sent away because they thought I was going to end up dead if I stayed in prison. I was prepared to stay and fight. I was prepared at this point after everything, and I realised that I'd been set up with all these bribe money being stolen. I was like, well, I'll stay here and I'll fight. Bugger it, I'll stay in prison. I'm going to survive. But people outside looked at me and said, Aaron, you're not going to survive 10 years in here, And then I got back here, so I'm reminded every day, and this will be something that until I get my kids back in my arms, I still struggle to come to terms with the whole situation. Did I make the right decision? Should I have just taken the beatings and jumped on a plane that first time in prison? Would I, I look at that. Did I pay for my going against my own moral code and giving up on that idea of what I believed was right? Is that how I paid for it? By entering into that corrupt system and paying those bribes? Is that how I was rewarded? I don't know. But I sorely... I do look back on that whole situation and my actions with, I'd say melancholy, uncertainty, confusion. But again, when push comes to shove, there's still lessons in there. And that's why I'm prepared to remain vulnerable, prepared to keep sharing the story, prepared to keep, I guess, opening up my life so that, maybe somehow someone can relate to it, even if it doesn't, not far-flung African prison, but can understand at that intersection, like you brought up that point, what is right to me? What am I prepared to do to stick to it?
Brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing with that. And whatever it took to share to you personally, I appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you, Judith, for the opportunity. I'm humbled to be able to tell it, and I am really grateful because, like I said, somewhere in all of this life experience, I've got some gold there for somebody. And so, every chance I get to tell it, there's another chance to learn more about myself as well. So thank you.
You're welcome. And I'm hoping you'll come back later on in your journey to have to give us an update as to what's going on.
Oh, you try and stop me. I love it. 6 months ago, I couldn't do this. I would have been really, of all the things I'd say, throw me back in prison before I would talk to someone about my life. Now, I quite enjoy it because it's also beautiful to have an external perspective question you. I like the idea of the questions. I like the idea because it pokes and prods the way I saw things. So that I'm able to look at it and go, "Whoa, hang on, Aaron, it might not have been exactly how you saw it." Because there's always 2 sides or 50 sides to every situation. So thank you.
No worries. Thank you so much.
You take care.
Thank you. Thank you once again for tuning into the Maverick Paradox podcast. I hope you have enjoyed listening to my conversation with Aaron as much as I enjoyed having it. At the Maverick Paradox, we improve your impact and influence by enabling you to effectively strategize, innovate, and execute. To find out more, contact us at judith@maverickparadox.com. Thank you. Are you interested in Maverick leadership but unsure how to apply it? We can help. Judith Germain has collaborated with David Chislett to produce a 12-part video series on Maverick leadership and how to apply it to your creative thinking skills. This will truly get you thinking and putting into action your ability to innovate and execute, truly changing your outcomes. Check out the show notes for the link or contact us on judith@maverickparadox.com for more information. If you are pathologically curious and would love to find out more about the Maverick Paradox, then please subscribe to this podcast on one of the popular podcast platforms. Alternatively, you could explore our resources on Mavericks at maverickparadox.com or read the Maverick Paradox magazine. We publish frequently each week. If you subscribe, you will get our monthly newsletter. And let's not forget my book, The Maverick Paradox, The Secret Power Behind Successful Leaders. For those that love a good discussion, you could apply to join our exclusive Facebook group. Finally, if you would like to work with us or are interested in the Maverick at work, check out maverickparadox.co.uk.